Hi, welcome to the 2018 Homeschool Moms Conference. I'm Katie Glennon, and I own Katie's Homeschool Cottage. And just so that you know who I am, I'm a homeschool mom of 15 years with two boys in college and over 30 years of education experience in the classroom, in different school settings, online, co-op, tutoring, and even teaching teachers across the Southeast in their classrooms. I also have degrees in English and secondary education. So, with all of my years of teaching and homeschooling, I try to share tips, helpful resources with parents who come to see me at Katie's Homeschool Cottage to take the load off you a little bit and a little bit of stress off of you so that you can enjoy your homeschool journey even more. So I have a list of things that I offer over at my website, including the classes I'm coming up with that are self-paced and they are video-based, as well as live online tutoring sessions personalized for each learner for their writing skills and abilities, as well as nature and unit studies, notebooking pages, and I've started a brand new Literary Cafe podcast, and I offer very practical and fun ideas of how to teach different areas of language arts in your homeschool from preschool all the way up through high school. So I hope you come and take a listen there and get some fun ideas for teaching language arts in your homeschool there. So you can find me at katieshomeschoolcottage.com and also on Facebook, Pinterest, and I'm actually starting to get into Instagram. Now, I have handouts to go along with our workshop, Why Study Literature in Middle and High School. So make sure you grab those handouts. And then also in your swag bag, you'll find a literary study toolkit that I put together and contributed to the swag bag for the conference. So make sure you look for that because that will help you with what to study also in your literature study. Now, there are 5 reasons why I like to study literature in middle and high school. One of the reasons is literature is a reflection of, and also it affects what happens in a society and in history. It's also an expression of worldview and gives a student practice in examining worldview. You also get a chance to look at the effective use of rhetoric and how it can make a reader feel and think, as well as reading fiction and developing sympathetic and empathetic understanding of other people and characters. And then the last one is developing higher order thinking skills and using those thinking skills with that piece of literature and really expanding those brain muscles. So the first thing I'd want to look at is how is literature a reflection of society? When you read a book that has some sort of background in a society or culture, it's like a window to the world. So, for example, in a certain historical time period, you might have an author writing about a certain place and what was happening in that time period at that place and what society was like. So you might have Jane Austen writing about the role of women and what a woman's life was like during the Regency period. Or pick up Charles Dickens and read about the poor and the working class during Victorian England. And that was a cause that Charles Dickens wanted to put in front of people. You have Upton Sinclair from the United States in the early 1900s sharing what life was like in the working conditions in the meatpacking industry. And then you have F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was part of the Lost Generation authors with Ernest Hemingway and others when he wrote The Great Gatsby, and he was writing a reflection of what life was like in the 1920s in society then, and as society was reacting to World War I. So it really does open up, as I said, the windows to the world. Now, it's also a reflection of culture. So if a book has a culture, then you can study what that culture must have been like. So for instance, with The Last of the Mohicans, you have a Native American culture. To Kill a Mockingbird, you have the South in the middle of the 1900s. The Good Earth, you have the culture of China and what life was like then. Um, You also have the reflection of not just culture, but their religious beliefs in literature. And of course, the Bible reflects the literature, reflects the religious beliefs and culture and life during the biblical times. You have mythology and epic poetry from ancient cultures sharing their religious beliefs. The Analects of Confucius, which of course just talks about what they believe in Confucianism. Rig Veda from India, those are hymns. Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita are an epic similar to the epic poems and mythology of ancient cultures. This one is about the culture and beliefs in India. And then, of course, you have the Quran, which is also, the beliefs in the Middle East. You also then have a reflection of history in literature when the writer is either writing about their own particular time period or another particular time period. And it can give you an insight into the historical events, also the people of that time period, and then places he or she experiences if they're in that time period. So for example, you might be reading Tolstoy's War and Peace, where it's talking about Russian history, or the Diary of Anne Frank, or The Hiding Place and the Holocaust, or A Tale of Two Cities with the French Revolution. Literature can also be an actual force affecting history. A piece of writing can affect what happens in history and then the events that happen after that piece of writing. So for example, something like The Rights of Man and Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, he purposely wrote those in order to affect history. He wanted to get more people to side with the revolutionists. You also have Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then Frederick Douglass writing the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and influencing how people looked at slavery. You have the Bible, which obviously affected history, and then you have The Origin of Species and the Communist Manifesto, which affected people's viewpoints as well in history. Literature can also be a reflection of worldview. So if you want to look at a piece of literature and determine its worldview, whether it is written in Christian worldview or from a secular or humanist worldview, literature gives you a great opportunity to look at those worldviews. And it does act like a pendulum, and we're going to look at that. Literature also expresses universal truths and morals. So let's take a look for a second at how does literature almost act like a pendulum to show the viewpoints of different time periods. In this timeline for American literary periods, you have on one side Christian worldview, and then on the other side you have humanist and secular worldview. Up to and including the colonial period, you had a Christian worldview. And that Christian worldview included the writings of the Puritans. And then they would write things like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And they would write their belief about God and God's relationship with people and how God had some kind of influence in their lives with the providence of God in their lives. Then came the Revolutionary time period, where you had writings such as Common Sense by Thomas Paine or the Declaration of Independence. And during this time period, you had the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason or Logic going on in Europe. And that affected what was being written and also believed in this American Revolutionary time period. You had a humanist and a secular worldview expressed in pieces of writing. And the focus was on this persuasion of science, or this persuasion of let's use our reason and let's use our logic. How do we want to move forward from here, from being a colony to independent states? Then the pendulum swings back again after the Revolutionary War period to what we call the Romantic period. And again, you have authors examining God, examining their spiritual beliefs. So you have the Scarlet Letter, which is from the Christian worldview, and it looks at the more Puritan morals and viewpoints. And then you have transcendentalism literature that includes the beliefs of Emerson and Thoreau and the life of Walden and God expressed through nature and the relationship of man with God through nature. Then you also have poets like William Cullen Bryant writing about nature, but it wasn't just about a waterfowl when he wrote To a Waterfowl. It includes God's hand in the creation of nature and God's hand in the life of humans. So that was from a more Christian worldview. Then the pendulum swings back again, and we're back to the humanist and secular worldview around the time period of the Civil War. And after, a little bit after the Civil War, we had the realist or realism time period around the Civil War, where you have the Red Badge of Courage. And it is looking at how the real viewpoint of what really happened and what you would really experience and feel and see during the Civil War with the Red Badge of Courage. And then Mark Twain was also a realist in that his stories were based in everyday life of an American and from his viewpoint. And he was also including the slang words and dialect and accent of a Southerner in his writing. So that made it realistic. You also had at this during this time period the naturalist or the naturalism period, where writers such as Jack London would write about nature and focus on nature as an example of the cycle of life and what life was like, and also fate, not providence, in the hand of how nature, the happenings of things in life. So you have fate, not providence, and you don't have God. You have man relying on his own reasoning and his own thinking skills in Jack London's stories. Then the pendulum swings back again, but not as far over again totally to just Christian worldview. For the modern period and the contemporary period, it sort of stays in the middle, where you have some Christian worldview and then you have some humanist worldview. So you've got writers exploring spiritual meanings and the existence of life and living in reaction to World War I and World War II, but you also have the humanist and the secular viewpoints during that time period as well. And then in the contemporary time period, you have writers that are writing from, again, a secular worldview as well as a Christian worldview. So you've got both of them during those time periods. Now, what do you do with that? Well, you can determine, where do you stand? What worldview do you have? Do you have a Christian worldview, or do you have a more humanist and secular viewpoint? And then you can practice identifying what the literature is that you're reading. Is it Christian or is it more humanist secular? And which one fits your personal beliefs more? So then when you look at this, you then can start examining literature as a whole and whether it has common themes. Regardless of your Christian worldview, does it have a particular theme that you see running across it and through it? It could talk about birth. It could talk about love. It could talk about beauty of an object, place, or person, challenges in life and how humans overcome those challenges, identity, their self-identity. An author or a character might be examining who they are and where are they going in life. Things that humans can relate to, happiness, sorrow, or even death. And then you can then examine the differences. First, what is utopian and dystopian literature, and then the differences in the piece that you're reading as to whether it's utopian or dystopian. And utopian literature tends to have a distinct line between good and evil. And you can practice whether that piece of literature you're reading has a blurred line. If good and evil becomes blurred, and if truth and morals are becoming more of a relative viewpoint depending upon the circumstances, so that something that you think is true and moral all of the time, then it becomes, well, no, I may change my mind on that because of this circumstance. So then you have gray areas and gray areas of belief. With dystopian literature, you can also look at the social and moral issues that develop in that literature and examine how they correlate with your own personal beliefs. So, for example, Brave New World, 1984, and even Frankenstein use technology and science that will have a social impact and will have a life impact on human life, freedom, and free will. Also, literature, and a study was done with this, can help readers develop empathy and understanding of human motivation. So we can begin to understand characters and develop sympathy and empathy for the characters because of what they've expressed in those stories, as feelings that they experience through the story, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're doing, how they're reacting to things. And because we've experienced that with the character as we read it, we become more in tune with people's motivations and their feelings. We can practice putting ourselves in their shoes, and then we can identify and also empathize with what they're going through. And this can help with a number of different skills. For instance, it can help us better our relationships because we can become more not just compassionate, but sympathetic and empathetic by where someone else is coming from and understanding their situation. And practice discussing scenarios in a story about maybe understanding that character's feelings or being another person who, what can they do to maybe help that person? So you're putting yourselves in their shoes and developing better skills at relating with other people and understanding where they're coming from. Then also social skills as far as personal and professional skills in dealing with problem solving and helping to establish solutions of uncomfortable situations or complicated situations. Literature study also, as I said, will help us develop higher order thinking skills and really help us expand those brain muscles. And it starts with recall and works all the way to synthesis. Now, recalling is just basically being able to remember basic facts and details from the story, such as the names of characters or places, or the name of a place, and being able to identify it and being able to identify the time that the story occurred. And that's when the author actually spells it out and tells it to us. We don't have to figure out where it happened and when it happened, as well as being able to identify and recall a certain action that a character takes in a particular scene, because that kind of information has just been clearly explained by the author. Also, now you might be more familiar with comprehension skills, and the comprehension skills are just one step above being able to recall facts and details. When we practice with our reader comprehension skills, we ask about what the story was about and describing the characters, describing how the story went, because we're now kind of summarizing and understanding what the author said, and then we're translating it back out and we're giving descriptions. We're not just giving facts. Next comes application, and that's a middle type of higher order thinking skill, where now we have to maybe interpret some information and add up some of the hints that an author has given us to let us figure out some details or specifics about the story, such as where did it take place? And if we take some clues and put it together, we can figure out where it took place. It takes some clues and figure out when it took place, because the author has not clearly spelled that out. Also, maybe solving a problem that's in the story, or being able to retell and relate to that story or situation, and explain how it might relate to us in a personal experience. The analysis is a little step higher above that, where we actually take the information and we can draw some conclusions that are a little bit more complicated than just figuring out the time and the place. We can also compare stories that the author has written side by side. That requires some more of a thinking skill, and maybe comparing one story that tells this theme and another story that tells the same theme, and compare two different stories that way. Maybe relating a more complicated situation in the story to a personal experience, or something symbolic has happened in the story, and being able to explain that symbolism in the story is an example of analysis. The next one after that, and this is one of the highest order thinking skills, is evaluation. And that's actually evaluating the story. You might be critiquing the story. Was it good or bad, and why? Maybe the author's writing, critiquing the author's writing and whether he executed or she executed the story well enough, why, or maybe they left something out. They didn't develop the plot for you, or they didn't develop the characters enough for you. So that's all part of evaluation. Taking an issue or a theme in the story and then arguing for that topic or against that topic would also be evaluation. For example, Brave New World, 1984. Frankenstein, as I said, using technology to either create life, alter life, change life, so that when it's born, it's going to be a different creation. So having a theme that is a moral issue where someone is like maybe acting as God or taking the place of God, you can discuss the pros and the cons and whether you agree or disagree and why. So that would be one of the highest order thinking skills, being able to do something like that. And taking a book like that and using a topic of a book like that is a great way to really get your teenagers to think. And then synthesis. Now, this is really the hardest and most difficult thing to do because you're creating something totally new and you're only using the piece of literature as a jumping off point. Maybe you want to create a whole new piece of literature and you're going to kind of just jump from the idea of the book that you read about. You're not going to rewrite it in your own words. You're not even going to use the same characters. You might use a theme or you might use a topic, but then you're creating a whole new story. Or you're going to create a game, or you're going to create, but it's going to be a whole new story. This is something that's kind of a little bit far-fetched, but an example, you're not going to just paint a picture of the story. That would be creating something new, but it's still about the story. Let's say you create a floral arrangement, but you're going to base this floral arrangement with the colors and the things that you put in the floral arrangement and the way you arrange it based on the story, but you have to explain why you did it. There's got to be some kind of connection. It can't just be some random creation. But that would be an example of a brand new creation. Pilgrim's Progress is a new creation based on, and it's an allegory for a Christian's walk in life. Animal Farm is a new creation based on the story and history of the Bolshevik Revolution. That would be synthesis. Prequel or writing a sequel to an original, such as Star Wars or Scarlet to Gone with the Wind, is an example of synthesis. And also, as I said, an original piece of artwork. The last thing is the effective use of rhetoric, and this can include vocabulary, word choice, complex sentence structure, literary devices and techniques, the author's or narrator's voice. And the use of vocabulary and word choice, obviously, the more you read, and the more you read good literature and even more complicated literature that some classics can be, the more selective and the wider the vocabulary. The more selective in word choice and wider vocabulary your reader is going to be exposed to. And then they're going to start actually using that the more they read. Also, the same goes with the complex sentence structure. Instead of having subject, verb, period, you have some authors who have very, very long, complicated sentences. And if you like that, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. But different authors are going to have different writing styles. But they're going to have a variation in their sentences. So instead of subject, verb, period, they might be having longer sentences with maybe an introductory word or phrase or clause at the beginning. They might have shorter sentences connected together with semicolons, or they might have shorter sentences plunked into the middle of longer sentences for effect. So the reader is going to notice that short sentence because it's going to make an impact. Those are the kinds of techniques with sentence structure that your reader is going to start noticing. And the more they read and get used to that type of writing, the more it is going to be reflected in their own writing. Now, Literary devices and techniques include a lot of different types of literary language and figurative language, but instead of just focusing on that and going through all the terms and definitions and stuff, I just want to just look for a second at using it as a technique or device to better your writing. And writers do this so that they're not just telling a story, but that they are showing a story, so that the reader can not only experience the feeling that the writer is trying to portray with the story, but also be able to see the picture that the author is trying to portray with the use of words. And as a reader learns to identify these devices and techniques, they can start appreciating the art of using these devices and using the words as a written artwork, so that it's painting a picture just like an artist paints a picture, but the writer is painting a picture for the story, so that the reader can see what's going on and feel what's going on and make an impression on the reader. Then, when the learner has learned to identify these techniques and devices, then they can start actually using them in their own writing and communication skills. Whether it's a story, a speech, an essay, they're going to be able to communicate effectively, create a mood, make an impact on a reader, have the reader feel something or see something, either to change their mind and sway them in a certain direction, or just to create a story that they can enjoy. Now, to recap, studying literature helps develop a knowledgeable student in history, culture, society across time periods and around the world, and provide a window to the world. It also provides students with practicing identifying worldviews and determining, and they probably already know if they have a Christian worldview or a humanist secular worldview, but then it helps them identify whether the author that they're reading also has that kind of worldview or a different one. Then they can look at the beliefs that the author is putting on paper, determine whether they agree with those beliefs, and filter it through their own worldview and say, well, yeah, I agree with that, or no, I disagree with that. And that's great practice for life skills when they get older and they're in different environments, and also even just listening to the news, because then they can determine whether they agree with what's happening, disagreeing with what's happening, or even believing what they're being told. It also helps students gain insight into human nature and motivation, and helps them with their people skills and relationship skills. It also gives them practice to identify with and sympathize and empathize with people, and develop problem-solving skills. It allows students to use higher order thinking skills and really expand those brain cells and those muscles, so that they can gain deeper understanding and being able to use that information in that literature, apply it to their own lives, think about it in deeper levels, and then even create something new. And then lastly, using the literary techniques and devices and examining how an author has written something gives them a new appreciation for writing as though it's an artwork, as though it's a piece of art, and also gives them their own tools to communicate more effectively and make an impact on this world, and allows them to have tools to better express themselves through the best possible word choice and descriptions. So I hope you can see that studying literature is a lot more than just reading a book and talking about it, answering questions, or even just writing a paper about it. There's so much to be gained from studying literature. Thanks for joining me, and I hope that you have found some helpful tips from this workshop. And remember to come visit me at Katie's Homeschool Cottage for more of these kinds of ideas and others. And I hope you continue to enjoy the conference.